Hey, you may have noticed, but it is in fact May, which means we need to talk about May releases that we are looking forward to. I have been feeling a little out of the game recently. You may have noticed, or may not have noticed, that I haven't been posting as much as I usually do, or I ideally would like to this last month. The ideas were there, I had things planned, but I fell into a little bit of a reading slump, and I don't know how much that slump is going to carry over into my excitement for upcoming releases. I think this may help push me back out of that slump. I also think I'm over the hump there, and it was partially just caused by life stuff getting in the way, but a lot of that has calmed down, and it was nothing to be concerned about in any way. It was just, life ebbs and flows. So let's go ahead and look at what I personally am excited about for May. The usual caveat, I am not going to cover everything. So you let me know what you're excited about as usual, whether there is overlap with what I'm excited about or not, especially because it could be something that I'm excited about and I just didn't have on my radar or missed, and it's not all about me, but I would appreciate being clued in to things that I would like. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start with May 7th, and the first book I have on my radar is The Ministry of Time by Kaylani Bradley. Now, unsurprisingly, probably, this has a time travel element to it, but a kind of quirkier workplace time travel element in relation to things we might be more familiar with, like time travel romance, all of which I really enjoy. And according to the blurb, this does have a romantic element to it, though there is this workplace angle and corporatization of everything a little bit as well, in that our protagonist is tasked with being the bridge for this historical figure, this time traveler who is referred to by the year he has supposedly come from, 1847, and he is thought to have perished on an Arctic expedition. So there is a little bit of boat book energy presumably here as well. Now, I know what you may be thinking, because I thought the same thing. Is this going to feel like Kate and Leopold? I cannot tell you because I haven't read it yet, but I'm intrigued by this romantic nature of it and the kind of corporate nature of it as well, and the idea that there are other time travelers that are characters kind of floating around, and I mean characters with a capital C, in that they seem to have their own kind of quirks. I was in love when I was a teenager with a time travel series called The Guardians of Time Trilogy by Marianne Curley, which I don't know how that series would hold up today, but involved a group of course, teenagers going back in time to kind of prevent chaos. And so there was a kind of structure and order to things in that as well. But here we seem to be looking at it more from a corporate angle, as I have alluded to before. And so there is a lot of opportunity for comedy there, because we are presumably going to be kind of mining the bureaucracy and kind of mundane nature of some of those systems, and then putting it up against those differences and mores that are one of the things that I am particularly attracted to in historical fiction and time travel in particular, I should say. So this seems like it's going to be both romantic and kind of comedic and quirky. There are a lot of things it's seemingly pulling from that are very interesting. It looks like it is a kind of blending of genres in terms of romance and thriller and this kind of comedic element that I am admittedly presuming is there. But I'm very intrigued by this title, and it feels kind of fresh and new in that combination, so I am very excited to see what we end up getting there. And then moving on, but staying in track with both the historical element or angle and the romantic angle, we have You Should Be So Lucky by Kat Sebastian. This is our next entry in baseball romances for the summer and is the follow-up to last year's We Should Be So Good. This is set in 1960, where We Could Be So Good was more firmly in the 50s, and if you were with me when I read that book and talked about being excited about that book, I am a lover of Kat Sebastian's historical romances, but I was a little hesitant for the more modern historical setting, particularly with the 50s. But I never should have doubted that book was charming, and it really knocked it out of the park, to steal a metaphor that we will probably want for this new book. So I trust that this book will give me a similarly satisfying emotional journey for these characters, while also kind of grappling with queer culture and queer history within these eras. And of course, then also the added sports element to everything. So this is involving a baseball player and a reporter. I do not remember if this is a partner that we know from We Could Be So Good, but I am willing to bet yes, or that we will have cameos to the reporters we do know from that book, just aged up. This reporter has recently suffered the loss of a partner in this book, so I'm assuming there will be some grief that is grappled with in this book. So if that is something that may be a stumbling block for you, just be aware. But historically, Kat Sebastian has done a really excellent job for me in her explorations and in her character building and in her world building. And so I'm excited to see that world building continue to explore new worlds. And I will be reading this. Also, all of these baseball romances combined with going to a game last year has me wanting to more actively go to a baseball game this year, and me and my friends are discussing it. So maybe I will be able to take this book and myself out to the ballpark, but we will see. And then we've got Beastly Beauty by Jennifer Donnelly. I believe this is published through Scholastic, so this is much more a young adult entry, and it is a return to our fairy tale retellings, this time with a gender-swapped Beauty and the Beast retelling, which has to exist in another form as well, surely, but I'm excited to see what Donnelly does with this. I have been a fan of Jennifer Donnelly since I was in high school, or maybe even middle school, depending on when A Northern Light was published, and I carried that into things like her Tea Rose or like Rose trilogy. I admittedly fell off during the Mermaid series. I read the first one and realized that I wasn't necessarily the audience for that series, which is fine. I don't need to be, and I shouldn't be, the audience for all books, but I'm still very, very interested in her work, and I am intrigued by the idea of a gender-swapped Beauty and the Beast, especially because it seems to be grappling with, based on the blurb, this idea of what emotions, especially young women, are allowed to entertain, and more importantly, I think, what they are allowed to act upon, because it seems to imply that there is a moment of anger that she is punished for, and what this looks like. And so having a female character that is exploring and grappling with messier emotions and being loved with those emotions as part of the picture is a really interesting angle to this, and I'm hoping that it really breathes some fresh air into the story, because it is a story that I and many love. It is a story family I particularly love. If you have watched my video talking about the story families that kind of grew out of the Cupid and Psyche myth, and so I am drawn to this, as many of us are, but there is also a little bit of like retelling fatigue I potentially am feeling. So I'm really trusting the author and the angle here, but at the same time, the fact that Scholastic is the publisher means that I am not the primary target audience for this book either, and that is okay. So I will jump in and see what it is and what it's exploring, and also view it through the lens of who the target audience is as well. But love Jennifer Donnelly. If you have read her, whether it be A Northern Light, The Tea Rose, or Revolution, some of those other books, let me know, because she has been in the game a while, and surely there are other Jennifer Donnelly fans out there. And then we have Badman by Julie May Cohen, which is my maybe I'll read a thriller this year. I got really burnt out on thrillers, and I recognize that there are like repeating tropes in a lot of the genres I gravitate toward. I just gravitate toward those tropes and those storytelling styles as well. So I needed to take a break from thrillers for a bit, but this seems to have a really interesting twist to it, in that we are following a female serial killer, which I know we've seen in thrillers. I'm not that out of the loop, but she is particularly targeting bad men, as it says on the cover. But she gets looped in with, and I'm unclear because there seems to be a romantic element here, but I don't know where it starts because she gets looped in with a true crime podcaster who is suspected of murdering his wife, and she believes he is innocent. And I believe, again, there is a romantic entanglement that is at play there, but I do not know if it is before or after the wife is killed. And that does make a difference in the narrative for sure, but I'm sure that will of course be made clear in the narrative. And again, it may be clear in the blurb and my reading comprehension skills are just lacking. But again, I'm very intrigued by the idea of true crime podcasters particularly kind of creeping in to thriller fiction and the way that that interacts with the community and the kind of voyeurism attached with the rise of true crime. I don't know if that is going to be addressed in this book again, but I think it's a really interesting angle that this could be approached from, and we'll see what angle ultimately. But yeah, if you are looking for a fun, fresh thriller, especially as we get into beach season, this is one that I definitely have on my radar. And then speaking of beaches, we have, of course, a boat book, which is nonfiction, and I will be reading the title off of the screen that I handily have just out of frame. And it is Left for Dead: Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the Edge of the World by Eric J. Dolan. I don't know if it's just me, and I have become even more clued into boat books over the last couple of years as my book club is particularly interested in boat books, but I also feel like we've had a rise in boat books, whether it be scientific expeditions that went awry, mutiny, or seemingly in this case, shipwrecks. Though the title does also mention treachery, so there is seemingly more at play, but this takes place in 1812, around the War of 1812, and involves a crew that is shipwrecked on the Falkland Islands. I'm also intrigued in that taking place against the backdrop of the War of 1812, in that it's nonfiction, and that was just the circumstances of what was going on at the time. The shipwreck involves both British and American castaways, and so there's going to be that extra level of things. How Lord of the Flies are we going to get here ultimately, I think, is my thought process. Granted, I do know that Lord of the Flies are school children, but I've read Lord of the Flies. The whole point of that book is the kind of like breakdown of society and niceties in these situations. So things are definitely going to go down for these castaways. But if you are on the hunt for a boat book for your own book club, here's another option. And then another thriller option after I just went on that whole spiel about thrillers. And granted, I have featured thrillers in other anticipated videos. I just recognize I'm not great about prioritizing those books in my own reading life. But The Return of Ellie Black by Amiko Jean, this is the first adult book from the author of Tokyo Ever After. I really liked Tokyo Ever After. I thought it was a charming book that was like a Princess Diaries for the new generation, and I really enjoyed it. And so I'm very interested to see what she is going to bring to a different genre and a different audience. And this follows a detective whose sister disappeared 20 years ago, and she has been searching for her since. And so when a girl who disappeared 2 years prior appears in the forest, it opens up a lot of questions that our detective is tasked with finding the answers to. And presumably this case connects in some way to her sister, or at least provides answers or resolution to her in some way regarding her sister. So I'm just intrigued to see what this thriller is going to ultimately look like. And then kind of shifting gears from thrillers, I really should cluster these better because we're kind of returning to a maritime beach setting here, though in a much different way. We have Whale Fall by Elizabeth O'Connor, not of course to be confused with Fail Whale, which the internet cultural relevancy of the Fail Whale is probably long past, especially since Twitter itself is kind of dead. but this is following a remote Welsh island community, and it's following a young girl there who has a lot of aspirations, and her world is slightly upset in 1938 when both a dead whale washes up on her island and ethnographers enter their community, which changes things, or at least presumably makes her more aware of how isolated she is. So this very much feels like a literary coming of age story, and we have that really reflected in the setting as well. So I'm very intrigued by this. Additionally, this is a debut and looks incredibly promising. And building on that idea of coming of age while also swinging back to the idea of time travel, we have a new middle grade release, The Secret Library by Kekla Magoon. This involves a young girl who, after the death of her grandfather, is feeling kind of the pressure of her family. Her mother is kind of like training her up to take over the family business, and she's just feeling that weight along with presumably her grief until she discovers a book that has been left to her by her grandfather that transports her to specific moments in time. And so she starts escaping into the worlds of this book that I believe tie into her family history specifically. But this book and the library it's associated with have secrets of their own, and our protagonist, Dally, ultimately has to kind of decide or figure out where exactly she fits within everything, both her mother's expectations and the kind of legacy of her family. And so very much that coming of age with these adventurous elements as well. So I think this looks like a really fun middle grade title, and I am excited to check it out. And then lastly, because I know there was interest, was it a couple months ago? Was it last month? Time is meaningless. There was interest in upcoming cozy mystery releases. And so we have You Can't Spell Treason Without T by Rebecca Thorne, which I know was originally, I believe, a self-published release, but it is getting a release from Bramble, and there has been a lot of buzz around it associated with that release. I know, especially in the ecosystem right now, I've always kind of prided myself on being aware of buzzy books and the big books, and self-publishing has really kind of complicated that just because there is so much. And so there may come a time when I come to you, or maybe there already has been a time when I come to you with a book for anticipated releases that is just getting its like traditional publishing release and has already been released as a self-pub title. I try to call it out. I don't always succeed, I am sure, because we are seeing a lot of self-pubbed books picked up into the more traditional publishing pipeline. I know I have thoughts on that. I'm sure you have thoughts on that, but it just being the fact of the matter, and if this is getting books in front of more readers, which I think it is, because otherwise these authors probably wouldn't be taking these deals, I am excited for authors to gain a wider readership, a wider audience, whatever works best or makes the most sense for them and their books, I am in support of. And so that is a long roundabout way of introducing this book that is a cozy fantasy following a queen's guard and a mage that are presumably high up in the court in the running of the kingdom, but really just want to run away and run a bookstore. But responsibility keeps them in their roles until there is a tipping point that is reached, and they ride off into the sunset to open this bookstore, to serve tea, and to live a much quieter, presumably still magical life. So I am not as well versed in cozy fantasy yet. I am very intrigued by this book, and I still need to read some of the books like Legends and Lattes that have really made a big splash onto the scene. So if you have recommendations for me on where you would start with cozy fantasies, let me know. And then moving on to May 14th, we are starting off with a book that is a decided shift, presumably, from cozy fantasy into Woodworm by Leila Martinez, also translated by Sophie Hughes and Annie McDermott. As you maybe saw on this cover, but probably not because the font contrast isn't superb, it does have a blurb by Mariana Enriquez. I love Mariana Enriquez, if for some reason you did not know that yet. And so I am very excited about this book because it seemingly has that weird haunted element to it. It feels kind of in the same vein as Enriquez's short stories, of which we are getting more translated into English this fall, and I am so excited. And so actually, let me just read you the back of this book. It says, "The house breathes. The house holds bodies and secrets. The house is visited by ghosts, by angels that line the roof like insects, and by saints that burn the bed sheets with their halos. Built long ago by a small-time hustler to control his wife, the house won't let their daughter and her granddaughter leave. When the mysterious disappearance of a boy draws unwanted attention, these two shut-ins, are they witches or are they simply enraged, combine forces with the spirits that haunt them in pursuit of something that resembles justice." Like, that sounds perfect. And it doesn't appear long, as evidenced by how long it looks, and so surely packs a punch. I'm sure it's weird and haunted, and that is a realm that I am finding a lot of satisfaction in right now. So very excited for this book. Also, it has these fun house end papers. So yeah, definitely going to check this one out. Obviously, I have it in my hand. I picked this up on Indie Bookstore Day. It was already out. I knew it came out early May, but I thought it came out the first week. I doubt this was a strict on sale book because this is going to be a very niche title, I think, but this is my niche. So I'm excited. Let me know if you are also excited. And then we have something that feels in a similar vein, though it is billed as more gothic. We have Spitting Gold by Carmela Lucas, which follows two sisters in Paris that are famous and fake mediums. So I'm thinking like the Fox sisters, of course. And in 1866, they come together for one last con where their targets are aristocrats who believe they're being haunted by their relatives killed during the French Revolution. So this has so many things I'm interested in: spiritualism, mediums in that historical setting, obvious fraudsters, the French Revolution, ghosts. There is so much going on here because I'm assuming it's playing with that idea of starting off with them being frauds, but potentially being faced with realities of the supernatural, as it mentions inexplicable horrors that they start to see as well. And so, I mean, inexplicable horrors could go a lot of ways, but within this framework, I am intrigued. It also mentions a queer sapphic element, so I am very hopeful that this will tick a lot of the same boxes much more successfully for me that the London Seance Society set out to do as well. And I'm not trying to trash that book in this moment, but I was ultimately disappointed by that book, and it was exploring so many things that I'm really interested in. So I'm hopeful that this will execute similar ideas in a way that aligns more with my reading tastes. So we will see. And then we have The Honey Witch, which I have already seen making romance rounds, and it looks like it's potentially a cozier or at least magical kind of romance in some way. It is a sapphic romance, and it involves our protagonist, Marigold, being whisked away by her grandmother to train to serve as the next Honey Witch, which comes with the price of sacrificing true love, but Marigold much prefers the company of spirits and is ready for this life. Until skeptic Lottie shows up at the cottage and Marigold finds herself wanting to prove to Lottie that magic exists and introduce her to the beauty of magic. And presumably also there is a love element there. So how do they get around the curse? We will all have to find out together. But this is definitely making me think of the very secret society of irregular witches. And so if you were as charmed by that book as I was, which I know many were, this may be one for you to check out as well. And then we have the newest novella from Veronica Roth, When Among Crows. I don't really have a full sense of this. It involves two protagonists, and the blurb emphasizes the relationship to pain. So I'm sure that is a metaphor in some way in this book. The first protagonist is a monster hunter. The other protagonist has been cursed with the ability to witness and see the horrors committed by what is referred to as the Order in the blurb, and this curse will ultimately kill her. And so our first protagonist presents her with a deal in which, in exchange for her helping him find Baba, I assume it's Baba Yaga, it is spelled Baba Yaga, but I assume it's Baba Yaga, that he will give her the cure to this curse. So intriguing. I'm most kind of intrigued by this blurb that seems very rooted in like Russian mythology that is also set in Chicago based on the blurb. And we know that Veronica Roth likes to set things in Chicago, that she is from Chicago. And so I guess I'm just interested to see what this is going to look like. It's very much a dark fantasy fairy tale feel to what we've got going on here. I have not listened to Roth talk about this herself, but as much as anything, I think I am just interested to see how Chicago is going to present in this book, because I read Chosen Ones when it came out in 2020, and we all know what was going on in 2020. And I found myself getting potentially overly sentimental about Chicago in that book, because I wasn't able to go about the city in the way I was used to. I remember there was a setting of what was essentially an abandoned Thompson Center, which we essentially have now too, or at least the food court no longer exists in the basement of the Thompson Center since it was sold. And I will miss that Arby's. I don't care how trashy that makes me. I read a lot of arcs in the basement of the Thompson Center back in the day. So anyway, I'm just kind of interested to see what this is going to be, and it doesn't look like it's going to be that long. And then we have A Crane Among Wolves by June Her, which is set in Korea in 1506. If you were with me last month, you heard me mention Stacey Lee as one of the preeminent YA historical fiction authors for me right now, and June Her is absolutely on that list for me as well. It is probably at this point the two of them, but I am very, very excited for this book after how much I loved The Red Palace. Feel free to go back and watch my Feature Friday on that book or on The Forest of Stolen Girls. But The Red Palace had a romantic element to it as well, which I particularly enjoyed. The Forest of Stolen Girls does not, if that is something you are not particularly interested in, like my friend Mandy. But A Crane Among Wolves seemingly also has a romantic element to it, but also a kind of potential enemies to lovers angle to that, or more accurately, reluctant allies, because we are dropping in on a portion of history that I admittedly do not know anything about. And so these books are also introducing me to new areas of history, but within this era, there is a tyrant on the throne, though despite this, our protagonist Isolde has led a life protected from this and isolated from this tyranny until her sister comes under the purview of this king. And so then she is setting out to rescue her sister from his clutches, and this puts her in the path of the prince, the king's half-brother, who does not agree with his half-brother's actions, with the king's actions, but has to be very particular and calculated in how he stages a coup because it has to be successful. And this means he doesn't really know who he can trust. But this also leads to the collision of our two characters' objectives and throws them in together. And so after the intrigue and the romance and the tension of Her's last book, I am so excited to see what we get here amongst, again, the intrigue of the palace and this idea that you don't know who you can trust, which I really enjoyed from the last book. So excited about this. And then we have another book in the Gothic vein involving a protagonist, Roos, who has a constant spirit companion, a companion that is described as corpse-like. And Roos has been involved with the world of seances with her mother, so we have that seance connection again as well, until she is thrown in with a wealthy widow and goes to live with her, and then the widow turns up dead. And Roos is suspected in this death, has supposedly been caught red-handed, but is blaming or referencing this spirit, which brings in a psychologist who has to determine if Roos is fit to stand trial, and obviously kind of digs into the question of whether spirits are real. So it feels a little bit like House of Hunger by way of Alias Grace, maybe. Again, I haven't read it, but with more gothic overtones. So I am very interested in this. So I don't have a whole lot to say or speculate about this one, but it looks incredibly atmospheric, and I am assuming a lot of this horror atmosphere, this gothic atmosphere, is also symbolism to explore some deeper themes, and I am excited to dive into all of it. So we will have to see what we get here. And another entry into my maybe I do like horror after after all? I don't know. We'll have to keep doing research. And then lastly, for the 14th, we have It Waits in the Forest by Sarah Dass, which follows Selena, who, unlike the other residents of her small Caribbean island, St. Virgil, doesn't believe in magic, and in fact is excited to go off into her future and study botany until a mysterious attack finds her father dead and her mother in a coma, and Selena, amidst her guilt, finds herself still on the island selling magical trinkets, or presumed magical trinkets, to tourists, despite the fact that she still does not believe in this magic. And then there is a string of murders that points to an evil lurking in the forest that pushes Selena together with her reporter ex-boyfriend in an attempt to solve what is going on. And so presumably, again, there is an element of the magical and the mystical that is being faced here, kind of combined or set against Selena's love of botany and science. So we'll see how science and magic blend within this world, but the idea of plants and the magic therein and the kind of blending of science and magic, especially within the realm of plants, makes a lot of sense. So we'll see how it goes here. And then I only have a few titles on my radar for the 21st. Well, the 28th has a few more. I think the 7th is definitely the heaviest release day of the month, but we still have some titles to look forward to on the 21st. Don't get me wrong. Starting with A Gamble at Sunset by Vanessa Riley, which seems to be the first entry in a new historical romance series, so I am on board. And it seemingly has this framing device and presumably the last love story of this newly widowed viscountess who is being approached by a duke who was presumably a former flame. It describes her as his first love and her being tricked into marrying another. And so in attempting to get her back, I assume, he has agreed or says he will help her sisters find matches, the first of which is going to be in this book. And this seems to be the first sister, Georgiana's book, who is a wallflower. We love a wallflower, so I'm sure we will be revisiting shortly with musical talent. And in a fit of ire against her sister, who she doesn't think is engaging with this duke's proposal adequately, she races off and kisses a stranger. Unfortunately, the town gossip catches her in the embrace of this stranger, who turns out to be a composer and the third son of a marquis. And so in an attempt to head off any potential scandal, they combine a feigned courtship with voice lessons, and so are thrown together, and presumably additional feelings develop. So very excited to see where this one takes us. And then we have Lies and Weddings by Kevin Kwan, the newest installment by the author of Crazy Rich Asians. This is not seemingly related to that series, and I admittedly have not read his most recent release, Sex and Vanity, but this seems to be playing in a similar world, in that kind of over-the-top landscape. But here we are dealing with the heir to a dukedom who has an empty trust fund and pressure to marry an heiress. And so amidst the extravagance of his sister's wedding, we are kind of looking at potential heiresses and suitors. Or will he pursue his heart instead of his pocket and ultimately go with the girl next door? So we will have to see, but I am expecting that extravagance, as I mentioned, a lot of characters. It will be interesting to see how that like lavish lifestyle and that portrayal of the lavish lifestyle, which is satirized in Crazy Rich Asians, obviously, but how it reads in the modern moment amidst the rise of Instagram influencers and celebrities and all of this playing against now the current economic climate and how that disparity feels very stark. So I will be interested to see if that is a commentary on that in any way, especially when we're looking at a protagonist who is kind of faking it in a lot of ways, in a world where we're seeing that from a lot of people online too. So that may be the commentary at play. I guess we'll have to read to see. And then we have The Word by Mary G. Thompson. This is a young adult novel, and it follows a young woman, Lisa, who after her parents split when she is around 7 years old, is convinced by her father to leave with him and is drawn into this cult. But when the police finally catch up to him 9 years later, Lisa is returned to her mother and the culture shock therein. So I am very interested in cults. I think a lot of us are, especially in the current moment. And so this is an interesting look at that kind of deprogramming, presumably. And moving on to May 28th to wrap up the month, first we have Cunning Folk, Life in the Era of Practical Magic by Tabitha Stanmore. And this is seemingly a social history exploring the use of practical magic to solve everyday problems throughout history. And I think it's going to kind of push us in very specifically to moments to kind of look at what this idea of practical magic looked like in different eras. And I'm fascinated by that, especially with the kind of cultural view of magic differing in different eras, but also the way that there were allowances for certain things, even amidst a culture we would not think of being accepting of magic, particularly for places under Christian influence. So this will be a very interesting exploration. And then we have Flawless Girls by Anna Marie McLemore. I am very behind on McLemore releases, but this follows two sisters who are sent away to finishing school, and Isla comes back within a day. She has no interest in this place that is churning out carbon copy socialites in a manner that is described in the blurb as eerie, until her older sister returns and is completely different, and according to the blurb, potentially murderous, and then just vanishes. And so Isla has to go into this finishing school to get a sense or find out what happened to her sister. And then I would guess that Isla additionally has to try and avoid a similar fate so that she can find her sister. And then kind of staying in that fantasy world, but this time through the lens of an RPG, we have 12th Night with a K by Alexine Farrell Falmouth, the same author writing incredibly popular titles under the pen name Olivia Blake, which I still need to read. But this is returning us to the world of 12th Night through a high school lens, which I know I'm in for because She's the Man is unironically one of my favorite movies. This time looking at the kind of character doubling of Viola and Cesario as characters in an RPG, which I think is such an interesting take. And then we have Viola Cesario getting closer to Duke Orsino, being played in the game by one of the popular boys in the high school, which then allows those other romances and mistaken identities to play out. And so I think it's just a really interesting lens through which to approach this retelling. And somehow I think 12th Night may be one of the Shakespearean plays I have interacted with the most. But yeah, I'm excited to see how it is interpreted here. And then we have Evocation by S.T. Gibson, which feels very odd to say just on its own, but nevertheless, that is what it is. This is, I believe, the second release from S.T. Gibson already this year, so I hope that that is not an unsustainable pace, because that seems like a lot, though I am very grateful because both books sound very interesting to me. This is continuing along in that kind of like dark magic vein, that gothic realm almost, that we've already explored a few times this month, which is very promising for me because that means I have lots of things in this vein I can go to. And this follows David, who was previously a psychic prodigy and is now staring down death's door after the devil comes to claim an ancestral debt, which puts David in contact, or he goes in search of getting in contact with his ex-boyfriend, who is also now a rival in the secret society they are both a part of. So we do have those secret society elements as well. And this seemingly involves David with both his ex-boyfriend and his ex-boyfriend's wife, Moira. So we'll see how that ultimately plays out, but the blurb looks promising into some kind of triangle potentially there. And so they are in a race to both acknowledge their feelings and stop this curse before the devil steals David away. And then we have Dreadful by Caitlin Rozakis, which may be of interest to our cozy fantasy fans as well, though it feels like it may be a little bit more comedic. It is blurbed for fans of T. Kingfisher, which upon reading the blurb makes me think of A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking for sure, which was my personal first T. Kingfisher, and I'm still not as well read as I should be, but it involves a protagonist who wakes up in a Dark Lord's lair with no memories, fearing the worst and having to fend off a Dark Lord, only to realize that they are, in fact, the Dark Lord. So there is a lot of comedic potential here, and there is mention of a garlic festival. So that gives me an idea of what kind of level of darkness we are potentially dealing with here, but we will have to see. So this could be like the light fantasy entry to our more gothic leanings this month. But with that, that wraps up the books that I have on my personal radar for May. So again, let me know what you've got on your radar, or let me know if any of these books are on your radar and you are excited about. As always, thank you for hanging out with me as I explore these books, especially if you are still here. And if you are still here and feel so inclined, go ahead and like or subscribe if you are not yet subscribed so we can hang out more. But most importantly, as always, read something good, and yeah, bye.